Despite a raft of sanctions, Russia has continued shipping and selling its crude oil to the world.
But over time, more and more of its revenues were going on shadow fleet ships. So now, I think close to 80% of Russia's oil revenues come from the shadow fleet.
It's extremely serious and it is extremely risky. These oil tankers are carrying over 100,000 tons of crude oil.
Additionally, most shadow fleet tankers are insured by Russian companies without reinsurance, meaning that in the event of an environmental disaster, there will be no financial coverage for cleanup costs.
Just as an army marches on its stomach, as Napoleon put it, money has always been the mainstay of war. Moscow needs financing to keep its army in the field and to produce war production. Russia derives most of its income from oil and gas exports. Unless these are significantly reduced, Putin has little incentive to stop fighting, despite Russia's enormous losses on the battlefield. That is why Ukraine's supporters in the EU and NATO have increasingly tried to tighten the screw. One aspect of this struggle was to reduce the EU's former dependence on Russian gas. At the beginning of the year, Ukraine closed the Urizhgoy-Pomory-Uzhgorod transit pipeline, pumping Gazprom gas from Siberia to Slovakia. The move deprived Gazprom of around USD 8 billion in annual revenues and largely eliminated Russia's remaining 8% share of the EU gas market. But the main source of Russia's revenue is oil. Last year, the Kremlin withdrew $16.4 billion from oil sales to finance its war effort in Ukraine. This was 5% more than in 2023. These oil sales allow Moscow to stabilize the ruble, control its budget deficit, and keep its balance of payments in credit so that it has money to pay for its imports. Moscow has found new markets for its oil in India, Turkey, and China. Given this market, the G7 has long sought to block Russia's easy access to international commercial shipping and insurance to move its oil to overseas customers. But Moscow has built a shadow fleet of at least 848 old tankers to circumvent the sanctions. Some of this fleet is owned by the state shipping company Sovcomflo, while the ownership of other vessels is unclear. The tankers are registered in countries not participating in the sanctions, such as the United Arab Emirates, Vietnam, Seychelles, and the Marshall Islands. They fly flags of convenience, such as Gabon, the Cook Islands, and Panama. But now the balance is changing rapidly. Panama is preparing to deal a heavy blow to Vladimir Putin's shadow fleet, his secret weapon in energy transportation. So how is this massive tanker network, which Russia has built to evade sanctions, under threat? How will Panama's move shake the Kremlin's oil trade? For answers to these questions and more, here is our video. But first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. The Panama Maritime Authority is in the process of deregistering 128 ships as part of a crackdown on blacklisted vessels. The move deals a heavy blow to Russia's efforts to maintain oil exports by circumventing Western sanctions through its Moscow-linked shadow fleet. Russia, which has been struggling with sanctions imposed over its invasion of Ukraine, has been taking advantage of Panama's flag of favour system. But Panama, home to the world's largest shipping registry, is responding to growing global pressure to tackle sanctioned regimes like Russia and Iran. Ramon Franco, Director General of Merchant Shipping, pledged last year to sanction blacklisted vessels and has since announced that at least 70 tankers have been removed from the registry. Stating that this process will continue, Franco said that with the regulations, the time to deregister ships has been reduced from 6 months to 1 week, a move that could cost Panama up to $2 million in lost revenue. However, officials emphasize that Panama will not remain neutral in the face of sanctions and difficulties in the sector. Russia's shadow fleet consists of at least 848 tankers. Of these, 493 are crude oil vessels and 385 are oil product vessels. So far, only 338 vessels have been sanctioned by at least one of the major sanctioning countries: the EU, the UK, Canada, and the US. Only 25 vessels have been sanctioned by all 4 jurisdictions. With Panama joining the sanctions movement, Vladimir Putin's secret money network will be in trouble. And the problems of the Russian shadow fleet do not end there. A Russian shadow fleet ship, carrying 100,000 tons of crude oil worth $43 million, was caught in a successful German operation. It is reported that the government will officially confiscate this so-called shadow tanker and its cargo. Customs officials say they initiated the legal confiscation on March 14th after the government and various ministries discussed how to handle the loaded tanker. The government decided to take this action as a demonstration against Russia and the shadow fleet after the European Union sanctioned the vessel for violating the G7 price cap on Russian oil in February 2025. The Aventin tanker is loaded with about 100,000 tons of crude oil, valued at over $43 million. Authorities are currently planning how and where to unload the oil and what will happen to the ship. Built in 2006, the Panama registered tanker turned out to be part of the shadow fleet serving the Russian oil trade. On January 7th, it had loaded from Ust-Luga and set sail with the declared destination of the Suez Canal. 3 days later, the ship was drifting in the Baltic. An examination of its documents showed that the ship had belonged to the mysterious Lalia Shipping since May 2024 and had no known address. The ship was operated from Dubai. Reports link the tanker to the Dubai-based tanker firm Fractal Marine DMCC, which is also involved in the Russian trade. Within days, the captain of the ship reportedly applied for permission to leave Germany after the Federal Ministry of Transport was notified that the engine had been repaired. However, the ministry said it had detained the tanker and was examining the ship's documentation. The ship is not just a floating hull, but part of a larger network of operations facilitating oil trade and perhaps even military operations. Partly serving Russian interests, the Shadow Fleet has been criticised for being linked to damaging undersea infrastructure such as internet cables and pipelines, an allegation that further complicates the geopolitical landscape. The weight of these actions falls heavily on German authorities as debate continues over the most effective method of responsibly pumping crude oil from Aventin reservoirs. The Mecklenburg-Vorpommern government, which is responsible for the region, is keen to speed up the process, in part to mitigate possible negative impacts on the local environment and tourism. The consequences of this seizure are not limited to just one ship and its cargo. Ongoing efforts to scrutinise shadow fleets imply a broader strategy to deter similar operations in the future. As government officials have noted, these stringent measures are intended to send a clear message to Russia about its actions in the region. Moreover, the steps against the shadow fleet were not limited to Germany. In a move that surprised the world, Canada imposed one of the largest sanctions against Russia. The new restrictions cover more than 70 individuals and companies, as well as more than 100 shadow tankers belonging to the Russian Federation. 109 ships from Russia's shadow fleet, the oldest of which was built in 1978, are subject to the restrictions. The restrictions included 92 oil tankers transporting Russian oil to third countries, 9 liquefied natural gas tankers transporting LNG to third countries, and 8 ships carrying weapons from Iran and North Korea to Russia. Another move against the Russian shadow fleet came from Finland. The Helsinki government announced that it had seized a tanker carrying Russian oil in the Baltic Sea, on suspicion of being responsible for disruptions in undersea electricity and communication cables between Finland and Estonia. It was stated that the name of the Cook Islands flagged ship was Eagle S, and that the Finnish Coast Guard boarded the oil tanker and towed the ship to Finnish territorial waters. Finland's National Bureau of Investigation said at a press conference that they are investigating a very large sabotage and that the anchor under the ship caused damage. The US has imposed measures against 183 ships in its shadow fleet and 2 major Russian oil companies, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftgaz, as well as Russian oil traders, oil field suppliers, and 24 subsidiaries. In addition to these measures taken by the Treasury Department, the State Department targeted Russian LNG exports. It announced its own sanctions package against 80 individuals, including a group involved in the metals and mining sector. Further sanctions were aimed at Rosatom, the state atomic energy company. It took some time for the US to tighten this oil noose on Moscow. But, as the US Assistant Secretary of Energy Resources at the State Department explained, Washington is now more confident that it can limit the rise in the price of oil as a result of these sanctions. This is because fresh oil supplies are coming in from the US, Guyana, Canada, Brazil, and the Middle East. The UK has followed Washington in adopting similar sanctions. UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy said that tackling Russian oil companies will drain Russia's war chest, and every ruble we take away from Putin will save Ukrainian lives. But no move has been as jarring as the one from China. One of Beijing's largest port operators banned Russian oil tankers under US sanctions from docking at berths in East China's Shandong province. The ships, which have been placed on a sanctions list by the US Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, are now completely barred from docking at Chinese ports, unloading cargo, and receiving any services. This is one of the toughest Chinese measures against Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin's sanctions-busting shadow fleet. But beyond these measures, China is determined to make a name for itself on the world stage. The Beijing government is locked in a bitter struggle with the United States over the Panama Canal. The canal has undoubtedly become the focal point of the US-China rivalry, which manifests itself economically, diplomatically, and strategically. Since the transfer of the canal to Panama, China has gradually increased its influence in the country, taking advantage of the opportunities created by the US withdrawal and Panama's economic liberalization. A turning point came in 2017 when Panama severed diplomatic ties with Taiwan to establish formal relations with Beijing. This decision opened the door to an influx of Chinese investment under the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly in port infrastructure and free trade zones around the canal. Washington quickly responded to China's growing presence by stepping up pressure in 2018 and 2019 to restrict Chinese projects in the region and protect US economic and strategic interests. As a result, US-China rivalry shapes many of Panama's strategic decisions. While President José Raúl Mulino's government has recently taken measures favouring US interests, China remains a major player. It is the second largest user of the canal and a major investor in many sectors of Panama's economy. This geopolitical struggle has become even more pronounced in recent days with the acquisition of CK Hutchison Holdings' stakes in the ports of Balboa and Cristobal by US investment giant BlackRock. Announced on March 4, 2025 in a joint statement, this transaction marks a significant withdrawal of Chinese involvement in the canal's strategic infrastructure and a strengthening of US influence. By securing these port assets, BlackRock countered what Washington perceived as China's tightening control over this vital maritime trading hub. The $22.8 billion deal was quickly applauded by Donald Trump, who hailed it as a reconquest of the canal by the US. But the Panamanian government was quick to soften this interpretation. President José Raúl Mulino emphasized that the transaction was a private commercial operation and in no way jeopardized Panama's sovereignty over port infrastructure or the canal itself. This episode highlights Panama's delicate position, sandwiched between two superpowers vying for control over an important maritime asset. While the country has expressed a desire to preserve its autonomy, economic and geopolitical realities are forcing it to manage US pressure while maintaining economic relations with China. More broadly, BlackRock's acquisition of the ports and French shipping giant CMA-CGM's $20 billion investment in the US on March 6 to expand its US-flagged fleet and modernize port infrastructure fit into Washington's strategy to consolidate its position in the maritime sector and offset China's growing influence on critical global trade infrastructure. The initiative comes after the Trump administration announced new tariffs of up to $1.5 million per berth for Chinese-built vessels calling at US ports. This measure prompted CMA-CGM to strengthen its presence in the US to comply with the new regulations and reduce its dependence on Chinese shipyards. So why is the Panama Canal an important infrastructure for the global economy? And why is it of great strategic importance for the US? The Panama Canal is essential infrastructure for global maritime trade, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and bypassing the long and costly route around Cape Horn. Around 5 to 6% of global maritime trade passes through this route, facilitating the transportation of manufactured goods and raw materials. It is particularly important for the United States, which built it between 1904 and 1914 and managed it throughout the 20th century until it was handed over to Panama in 1999 under the Torrijos-Carter treaties signed in 1977. Since the handover, it has been managed by the Panama Canal Authority, an autonomous organization separate from the Panamanian government. Its status as an inalienable national asset is enshrined in the Constitution and ensures that its management remains under the exclusive sovereignty of Panama. However, the United States continues to see it as a key element of its influence and economic security in Latin America. The canal is a strategic route for US exports and imports, linking both the East Coast and Asia, the West Coast and Europe, and the East and West coasts of the country. More than 70% of the goods transported through the canal originate from or are destined for a US port. This makes Washington a major user of the canal. The Panama Canal is also a key component of US naval strategy, allowing the US Navy to quickly transfer ships between the Atlantic and the Pacific. This reliance on the canal is accompanied by increased attention to its control and management. According to the principles set out in the Torrijos-Carter treaties, and given the strategic interest of the United States in ensuring the free movement of goods and preventing any foreign interference that could disrupt the canal's operations, the United States continues to play a role in its security and neutrality. Beyond protecting sea lanes, this attention extends to monitoring foreign economic and political influence. In sum, the Panama Canal is not only one of the main arteries of global trade, but also at the centre of geopolitical and economic contention between the great powers. The rivalry between the US and China increases Panama's strategic importance, while the issue of Russia's shadow fleet makes the region a more complex geopolitical node. Sanctions against Russian oil tankers passing through Panama by the US, Germany, Canada, and the UK are part of the West's effort to increase economic pressure on Moscow. However, Panama's compliance with these sanctions has led Russia to seek alternative trade routes, while major actors such as China are also trying to tip the balance in its favour. China, in particular, continues to become Panama's main trading partner by increasing its investments and economic influence in the region. While this is perceived as a threat to the US, the Washington administration wants to maintain its influence over Panama to protect both its security and economic interests. On the other hand, restrictions on the transit of sanctions-evading oil tankers, known as Russia's shadow fleet, through the Panama Canal directly affect global energy flows. As a result, the Panama Canal is now critical not only for trade, but also as a reflection of the rivalry between the great powers. At a point where the interests of the US, China, and Russia intersect, Panama's efforts to remain neutral are being put to the ultimate test. In the long run, however, Western sanctions, China's influence in the region, and Russia's energy strategies will be the determining factors in Panama's policy choices. How this complex equation is resolved is critical not only for regional actors, but also for the global economy and geopolitical balances. Stay tuned for further developments. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like us.